Imagine you and an ancient tribesman are both dropped into the same wilderness on the same winter night. No warning. No preparation. The temperature is -40 degrees. The wind is moving fast enough to strip heat from exposed skin in under 4 minutes. Now ask yourself honestly, who survives until morning, and who doesn't? Most people assume the answer is obvious. We have centuries of scientific progress behind us. We have modern materials, modern knowledge, modern everything. But here is what the evidence actually shows. In January 2019, a polar vortex swept across the American Midwest. Temperatures dropped to levels not recorded in decades. And despite central heating, insulated homes, and emergency services on standby, dozens of people died. Healthy adults. People with every modern advantage. Meanwhile, 1,000 years before any of that existed, entire communities of men, women, and children were not just surviving winters like that, they were living through them. Cooking, raising families, passing down knowledge, staying warm without a single piece of modern technology. And the reason they survived has almost nothing to do with physical toughness or fearlessness or brute endurance. They understood something about heat, cold, air, and earth that modern civilization has quietly forgotten. Archaeologists have spent decades uncovering the remains of these ancient winter systems, and what they found still surprises researchers today. There was one technique, a single architectural decision, that changed everything. A method so effective that versions of it still appear in Arctic survival engineering right now. And by the end of this, you will understand exactly what it was, and why we ever stopped using it. The first decision these communities made was not about materials, or tools, or fire. It was about location. And that decision alone could mean the difference between a family that survived the season and one that did not. Northern tribes did not simply settle wherever the ground was flat. They read the landscape the way a modern engineer reads a blueprint. Dense spruce forests were chosen deliberately because thick tree canopies disrupted freezing winds before they could reach the shelter. Low ground near open water was avoided because cold air drains downhill and pools in open spaces like an invisible flood. Flood-prone riverbanks were rejected. Exposed ridgelines were rejected. Every piece of land was evaluated through a single question: will this ground protect us when the temperature tries to kill us? This was not instinct. This was geography, refined through generations of watching who survived and who did not. But location was only the beginning. Because once they chose the right ground, these communities made a decision that changed everything. Instead of building upward into the freezing air, they dug downward into the earth. And this is where the real science begins. Below the surface, soil temperatures remain dramatically more stable than the open air above. At just 3 to 4 feet underground, the ground holds temperatures that can run 30 to 40 degrees warmer than the deadly air at the surface during deep winter. The earth itself became the insulation. Wind exposure dropped to almost nothing. Heat loss slowed in ways that no above-ground structure could match. This was the architectural breakthrough that made long-term winter survival possible, and it appeared independently across multiple northern cultures. For one reason it worked. Once the frame was set into the earth, the walls were built in layers, and every single layer had a purpose. Large timber beams carried the structural load. Over them came sheets of bark that sealed against moisture. Then moss, packed carefully into gaps, because moss traps microscopic air pockets that resist heat transfer. Then sod and packed earth on top, adding thermal mass that absorbed heat during the day and released it slowly through the night. Nothing in this construction was decorative. Nothing was accidental. Each material belonged to the environment surrounding it, and each material solved a specific problem that the one beneath it could not. Then came the entrance. And this is the detail that surprises people most when they first hear it. The doorways of these winter lodges were not doors in any sense we would recognize today. They were long, low, tunnel-like passages that forced anyone entering to crouch and move slowly through a narrow corridor before reaching the living space. To a modern observer, this looks uncomfortable and inefficient. But it was one of the most sophisticated thermal decisions in the entire structure. Hot air rises. Cold air sinks and flows along the floor. A direct doorway would allow freezing outside air to rush immediately into the warmth at ground level. The tunnel interrupted that exchange entirely. Cold air stayed trapped low in the passage, while the warmer air, deeper inside, remained undisturbed. These entrances functioned as primitive airlocks, and the physics behind them is identical to systems used in polar research stations today. Inside, sleeping platforms were raised above floor level because the coldest air in any enclosed space settles near the ground. Families slept higher, where temperatures stayed meaningfully warmer through the night. Fires were kept deliberately small, burning as steady coal beds rather than open flames, because a massive fire consumed fuel faster than it could be gathered and produced heat that escaped before the body could absorb it. Heated stones were placed near sleeping areas to release warmth slowly over hours. Animal furs were layered in specific combinations to trap collective body heat between them. Every single choice was a calculation against energy loss, because in deep winter, wasted heat was not an inconvenience. It was a death sentence. But here is what no textbook tells you. Solving the cold created an entirely new problem, one that could kill just as fast. A perfectly sealed lodge with no airflow became a slow trap. 6 people sleeping in an enclosed space produce roughly a pint of water vapor every single hour through breathing alone. That moisture settled into furs, into walls, into clothing. Wet cold strips heat from the human body far faster than dry cold. And beyond moisture, smoke and carbon monoxide built silently in sealed spaces, invisible and odorless until it was too late. So these communities developed ventilation systems of surprising sophistication, roof openings, lined with adjustable bark flaps that could be repositioned depending on wind direction. Fires placed deliberately beneath controlled gaps to draw smoke upward without pulling cold air down. The balance they maintained was extraordinarily precise. Too much ventilation, and the warmth they had fought to build would vanish within an hour. Too little, and the air inside would quietly turn poisonous. They held that balance every single night, through every storm, for months at a time. Not every tribe faced the same winter. The cold was the same enemy, but the landscape changed the battle entirely. And what makes the engineering of these ancient communities so remarkable is not just that they solved the problem of winter, it is that they solved completely different versions of it, in completely different ways, and all of them worked. For communities living beside northern rivers, the water that gave them life in summer became something close to a weapon in winter. Rivers provided fish, travel routes, and fresh water. But when temperatures dropped, that same river transformed into one of the most unpredictable forces in the natural world. Ice jams formed upstream and released without warning. Frozen banks collapsed under pressure, and the sound that every person in those camps learned to fear above anything else was the deep, resonant crack of shifting river ice in the darkness. Imagine lying inside a lodge on a January night, the fire banked low, the children finally asleep, and then that sound moves through the valley like a slow fracture traveling through glass. Every adult in that shelter would be awake within seconds, not panicking, but listening, calculating, deciding. That controlled fear, that trained alertness, was itself a survival tool. To protect against flooding, river communities built their winter lodges on elevated terraces set well above the waterline. Drainage trenches directed meltwater away from the structure. And in some cases, rather than cutting a ground-level entrance that floods could reach, they built roof entrances, instead hatches cut into the top of the lodge, that forced anyone entering to climb down rather than walk in, sealing the living space completely against rising water and penetrating wind. Then move away from the rivers and into the frozen marshlands, and everything changes. In wetland environments, the ground itself was the enemy. The earth was waterlogged, unstable, and alive with freezing moisture that rose from below as much as it fell from above. Cold mist settled across the wetlands and clung to clothing, to skin, to anything it touched. Digging downward, the way forest communities did, was simply not possible here. The water table sat too close to the surface. So marshland tribes did something that seems almost counterintuitive. They built upward. Elevated platforms raised on wooden posts, driven into shallow ground, lifted families entirely above the layer of freezing moisture at ground level. Plank walkways connected structures and reduced direct contact with unstable ice. Walls built from densely layered reeds trapped air pockets between their stems, creating natural insulation that breathed just enough to manage moisture without losing warmth. Steep roof angles shed snow and prevented the kind of weight accumulation that collapses flat structures. These buildings looked fragile from the outside. They were not. They were precisely engineered for an environment that would have destroyed any other design. Two communities, the same enemy, completely opposite solutions. Both survived. And that contrast carries something important. There was never one single answer to winter. There were only careful observers who understood their specific piece of land well enough to let it tell them what to build. But there is a third challenge that neither architecture nor engineering could solve alone. And this one is the most human of all. In the far north, winter darkness stretches to 18, sometimes 20 hours a day. For the first week, the body adjusts. For the second week, it begins to struggle. By the third week of confinement, reduced movement, and near total darkness, the human brain starts to fracture in ways that are now well documented by modern psychology. Mood collapses. Judgment deteriorates. Social bonds weaken under the pressure of forced proximity without relief. Ancient communities had no clinical name for seasonal depression, but they understood its symptoms with devastating clarity because they had watched it destroy people. And so, they engineered a solution for the mind, with the same precision they applied to walls and rooftops. The fire at the center of the lodge was never allowed to go dark, not only because of warmth, but because fire served as a biological clock in a world without daylight, a fixed point of light and rhythm that anchored the nervous system when everything outside was black and formless. Storytelling happened every night, not as entertainment, but as a regulated practice of shared attention that modern research now recognizes as one of the most effective mechanisms for maintaining social cohesion and psychological stability under prolonged stress. Music, ceremony, and ritual created predictable moments of collective experience that gave the days shape when the sun refused to. They did not just engineer their shelters. They engineered their minds. And that may have been the most sophisticated survival system of all. Here is something that should stop you for a moment. Some of the most expensive, most celebrated eco-homes being built today in Scandinavia and Canada. Structures that win international architecture awards and sell for millions of dollars. Use thermal principles that are structurally identical to what these ancient communities developed without blueprints, without universities, without any written language at all. Passive insulation layered from the outside in. Semi-subterranean foundations that borrow stable temperature from the earth. Controlled ventilation systems that balance fresh air against heat retention. Low, buffered entry points that reduce direct wind penetration. The language is different. The materials are modern. But the logic is the same logic that a family in the subarctic worked out through generations of watching, failing, adjusting, and surviving. What makes this even more remarkable is that none of these features existed in isolation. The tunnel entrance only worked because the sleeping platform was raised. The raised platform only worked because the ventilation was calibrated correctly. The ventilation only worked because the layered walls maintained enough thermal mass to absorb the heat that the fire produced slowly and steadily through the night. Pull any single piece out of that system, and the whole thing becomes less effective, sometimes dangerously so. This was not a collection of clever ideas. It was a single integrated organism, and every person living inside it was part of its operation. Close your eyes for a moment and place yourself inside one of these lodges on a February night. Outside, the temperature is dropping past 40 below. The wind is moving through the trees in long, slow waves. But inside, the fire glows quietly beneath a thin column of rising smoke. A child breathes softly beneath a stack of layered furs. An elder's hands move steadily in the firelight, working leather or sinew, calm and unhurried. Someone murmurs something low and the sound carries warmth of its own. This was not survival in the desperate sense we imagine it. This was a life, complete and considered, built around the careful management of warmth in a world that offered none. The lodge was not a building. It was a decision. A daily commitment made by every person inside it, renewed each morning when the coals were checked, and each evening when the vents were adjusted, and each night when the fire was banked just low enough to last until dawn. So we return to the question we began with. How did they survive? Not through brute strength, not through fearlessness, not through some genetic advantage that modern bodies no longer carry. They survived because they listened to the wind moving through spruce trees, to the sound of ice shifting on a river at 2 in the morning, to the way smoke behaved near a roof opening, to the way cold air pooled at ground level while warmth rose slowly above it. They listened to the world around them with a precision that most of us will never need, and from that listening, they built something extraordinary. But here is the question that stays with me long after the research is done. The real question is not how they survived the cold. The real question is, what have we forgotten that they already knew? Because every feature of these ancient shelters was not an invention. It was a memory encoded in wood and earth and stone. A tunnel entrance means someone once understood exactly how heat escapes a room. A raised sleeping platform means someone once noticed where cold air settles in the dark. Layered walls of moss and sod means someone once discovered that still air, trapped in small pockets, resists cold better than any solid material. These were not blueprints. They were living knowledge, passed from one pair of hands to the next across hundreds of winters, never written down, never lost until it was. The people who built these shelters did not conquer winter. They did not fight it or defeat it or rise above it. They became part of it. They learned its rhythms and its physics and its psychology, and they wove their lives into it so completely that the boundary between the human world and the natural world dissolved into something quieter and more honest than most of us will ever experience. If that kind of intelligence speaks to you, if the idea that ancient people understood things we are only beginning to rediscover feels like something worth exploring further, then stay close, because there is much more of this world left to uncover.